Oh,
Hi.
got to admit some latecomers here. Right. Well, welcome to all of you. My name, now most of you are old friends, but we do have some new people here who have uh, joined as part of the Benedict 16th Institute family. So my name is Maggie Gallagher. I'm the executive director of the Benedict 16th Institute for Sacred Music and Divine Worship. We were founded by Archbishop Cordileone, and he is the chairman of our board. And our mission is opening the door of beauty to God, evangelizing through sacred beauty. And we do this through two great strategies. One is to provide practical resources for more beautiful and reverent liturgies. Pause, which means we're not a think tank about the liturgy. That's very important work. But it's not what we do. What we do is we aim to create, foster, and encourage more beautiful liturgies in the great high music tradition with our composer in residence, Frank LaRocca, and also in parishes through chant camps and in other ways. Our second strategy is helping to energize a culture of the arts. The way this day, I want to just review for you what will be happening here. The Archbishop will open us in prayer. And then our senior fellow, Amy Giuliano, who if you haven't met her yet, some of you came to her talk on Michelangelo's Pieta, so you know she's extraordinary. She was trained in theology at the Angelicum in Rome, where she also served as an art guide to the great treasures. And then she studied digital media and art history at Yale University, who was so impressed with Amy that when she left, they gave her a grant to buy the equipment to launch her mission, her apostolate, which is called vadisvr.com. And she makes digital 3D versions of sacred Catholic spaces. And you're going to experience her work today, so I don't need to say that much more about it right now. Then he's going to be a little late, but he will be joined by Andrew Galvin, who is, I don't know his title, the curator at Mission Dolores. But more importantly, for our purposes, he is the great-great-grandson of Chief Turismo, who laid the cornerstone to the San Jose Mission Church, and was also, we recently found out, baptized at Mission Dolores in 1794. So he is in the direct spiritual lineage of St. Junipero Serra, and he's going to tell us a little bit about why this much maligned man is indeed a great and holy saint who we should all be proud of, the Apostle of California. And as James Matthew Wilson, our poet in residence, reminds us, he's also part of that other founding of America. While on the West Coast, on the East Coast, the Pilgrim founding fathers were coming from England and Northern Europe. On the West Coast, it was the Catholic missionaries, the Jesuits, and then the Franciscans who helped forge this great country of ours. So that's the Catholic part of this founding story that we don't hear as much about. Looking forward to that. I am going to, in the end, give you a review of what we have planned for this year in the Benedict 16th Institute, and ask those of you who are donors if you can, at a minimum, renew your support to get us through these difficult times. But I know that right now the moment is really about the Archbishop Cordileone's great leadership in freeing the Mass. So I'm going to try to get out of the way of the Archbishop and you, his friends and supporters, and give him a chance to tell you a kind of personal report on that, where we are, where he's going. And you guys can ask him about Benedict 16, of course, but also maybe if you have questions about what's happening, this will be your chance to chat with the Archbishop. If you come to our Zoom events, and we've now had 17, I think, Zoom events since April, we usually end with a social half hour to chat. This event is going to be longer than usual, so we won't do that. But if you like this event, I urge you to consider coming to our other Zoom events. There's one October 2nd with the winner of the Catholic Literary Arts Poetry Contest, where they offered poets some paintings by living Catholic artists, and then the winning. So we'll invite the painter who inspired the poet's poem too. All right, long introduction. My turn to get out of the way. Archbishop, will you lead us in prayer?
Okay, good. Fine. Thank you, Maggie. So we're on this feast day of Saints Cosmas and Damian. We're going to have a wonderful visit, a pilgrimage, I would call it, to their church, thanks to Amy. So I thought I would begin by reading an excerpt from a sermon by St. Augustine that is read in the Divine Office, or the different hours that priests and monks and canons and more increasingly lay people read. There's a longer office that's traditionally prayed very early in the morning, called the Office of Readings or Vigils, and there's two long readings after the Psalms, a scripture reading, then a reading from a father of the church. So I'd like to read an excerpt from this sermon from St. Augustine, that is that second longer reading from this feast day of Saints Cosmas and Damian, where St. Augustine speaks about the martyr's death as brought about by the death of Christ, and it is precious in his sight, and then conclude with the collect for the saints. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Amen. On the cross, Christ effected a great exchange. There, the purse containing the price to be paid for us was opened. When the soldier's lance cut its way into his side, the price paid for the whole world flowed forth. The martyrs and all the faithful were bought with it, but the faith of the martyrs was also tested. Their blood bore witness to their faith. They gave back what had been paid for them and lived up to what St. John says, as Christ laid down his life for us, so we should lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Elsewhere we read, you have taken your seat at the great table. Consider carefully what is set before you, for you must prepare the same in return. The great table is the one at which the Lord of the banquet is himself the food. No one feeds the guests with his very self, yet that is what Christ the Lord does. He invites, and he is the food and drink. The martyrs took careful note of what they ate and drank, so that they might return the same. Let us pray. Lord, we honor the memory of Saints Cosmas and Damian. Accept our grateful praise for raising them to eternal glory and for giving us your fatherly care. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amy, take it away. Amy Giuliano.
Cool. Can you all hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for that beautiful prayer, Archbishop.
Amy, I'm going to mute. Unless you want people to be able to ask questions, I think I should mute everyone and then unmute yourself. Let me do that. So I'm going to mute all. And Amy, you can unmute yourself.
I'm also going to share my screen.
So you need to be co-host. I didn't do that.
All right. Thanks. All right. Can you all see my screen? Yes, you can see from the catacombs to the church. Perfect. Wonderful. Well, I'm very happy to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics. And what we're going to do today is go on a journey from far outside the city walls of Rome. We're going to visit the catacombs. Then just within the city walls of Rome, we'll see St. John Lateran. And finally, we'll end in the heart of the Roman Forum at the Basilica of Saints Cosmas and Damian. So it'll be a 3-stop pilgrimage that will encompass the first 500 years of Christianity within the city of Rome. And what I'm going to try to do for you is take some of the city's art and architecture in order to illustrate the development and the movement of Christians into the very heart of ancient Rome. So we'll start with the Catacombs, move to St. John Lateran, and finally end with Cosmas and Damian. And it's at Cosmas and Damian that we'll see that virtual tour. Just to give you a very brief introduction to the virtual tours, I create the virtual tours there. Like, I use a 3D laser combined with a camera to document and digitize these sites of the church's artistic heritage around the world. So I've made them in Jerusalem and Rome, Ravenna, London, and the US. Actually, we're working on the mission churches, digitizing the mission churches right now, thanks to the Benedict XVI Institute. So I go to these sites in order to digitize them for the purpose, first of all, of access. So I want to provide unprecedented access to sites that many Christians might otherwise never see. So I was inspired by teaching. I had students who they didn't even know that these churches existed, and their idea of the church was very much attached to their own parish. And so I wanted to bring them the living classroom of Rome into their classrooms, onto their computer screens, and let them explore on their own. So I'm trying to provide access with these tours. Secondly, education. I create videos to embed within the tours that are educational and interactive so that the person can learn about the site and the meaning, the theological meaning behind its art and architecture by exploring. And finally, the tours create a 3D model with all the precise measurements of that space in order to preserve that site of cultural and religious heritage for future generations. And those measurements that I create and that 3D model I create through making these tours, it allows people who are working on restoration or reconstruction in the case of damage to work on that site with a 3D model to guide them. So that's a background to that. You'll see the virtual tour when we get to Cosmas and Damian. I made that in Rome a year ago. So let's get started on our trip. As I mentioned, we're going to see Christianity during the age of persecution, and that's represented by this first map. You see these little white crosses, and they're indicative of the catacombs that are far outside the city walls of Rome. So Romans did not bury their dead within the city walls. They're always outside the city walls. So you see Christians during the age of persecution. I think the catacombs, really topographically speaking, represent symbolically Christianity during an age when it is cast outside of the city. It's hidden, it's underground, it's persecuted. The central map, I put a red cross right where St. John Lateran is. So St. John Lateran is the first public Christian church in the world. So they call it the mother and head of all Christian churches. And it's built just within, it literally abuts the city walls of Rome. So you see that Christianity, finally it's legalized by Constantine, and he gives this property for the Christians to finally have a church that's out in the open. And this third map, you see the second red cross, that's the church of Cosmas and Damian, and it's in the epicenter of the ancient Roman Empire. It's in the Roman Forum on the Via Sacra. This is the legislative, religious, and administrative center of the entire empire. So we see over the course of 500 years, from the time when Christianity enters the city of Rome to the time that the Church of Cosmas and Damian is dedicated in 525 AD, this development where Christianity penetrates into the very heart of Rome, and there's this victory, an amazing victory after a wave of 10, well, there were more than 10, but 10 major persecutions before Constantine. So Christianity not only survives, but is victorious. So those are the 3 stops we'll make along the way. And the final one will be the virtual tour of Cosmas and Damian. So our first stop, the Christian catacombs. So I'm just listing them here. I'm sure some of you have visited these sites, the catacombs of Priscilla, Agnes, Callistus, Sebastian. And as I mentioned, Christianity is legalized by Constantine in 313, but there's waves of persecutions during this time. For example, the persecution under Nero from 64 AD to 68, that's the persecution that took the lives of Peter and Paul. And with Diocletian at 303 to 311, that's the persecution that took the lives of Cosmas and Damian. They were twin brothers. So here we see the catacombs. Again, I had mentioned that symbolically speaking, we can think of the catacombs as representing a Christianity for its first 300 years of existence in Rome, as one that's cast outside the city walls, hidden underground and persecuted. You see the catacombs, they're lined with these things called loculi. So they're just little burial places. You can see in this image that they weren't uncovered as we see here. They used to be covered over, usually with a marble slab. See this person with a mortar, with mortar putting, cementing that marble slab into the wall over the body. So that's what they would have looked like. Also, we have a false sense because there's electric lighting down there now. It would have been torchlit. It would have looked quite different. Now, this is one of the marble slabs that would cover a grave, one of the loculi. So it's the grave of Nicella. You see that first word here. And what I wanted to point out by looking at these grave markers from the catacombs is that Christians begin to represent Christ and their faith in oftentimes more covert and hidden ways. They don't come out there. It's few and far between to find. There are some images of Christ, overt images of Christ in the catacombs, but more often you find some covert images that could also be considered, they were used in pagan Rome in a larger context. So the anchor, if you see it here, it refers to the cross because it has that cross shape. But it's also interesting to note that the nave of a church, that's the central section of a church, it's called a nave because it comes from our word for boat. So like we think of a naval battle, or even Piazza Navona in Rome was used by the Romans to set up, they set up pools for mock naval battles. So Navona, the nave of the church is that central section where people sit. So it's this idea that we're all in the same boat as Christians heading towards the safe harbor of heaven. So this person who's passed away, the anchor represents that final destination of the safe harbor of heaven. I also think it's interesting that the earliest Christians, as they're expressing Christ, visually, they use word play to depict the word made flesh. So we see, for example, this fish. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the ichthus. So in Greek, it's the word for fish. And it also stands for, each of the letters stand for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. So it's kind of a covert way of indicating one's Christian faith. We also see the chi rho. So the first two letters of Christ's name, Christos in Greek, the Alpha and the Omega. Christ refers to himself as such. And here we have a dove. The dove is sometimes a symbol of the Christian soul, but here, because it has the branch in its mouth, it's actually a symbol of resurrection to new life, because Noah releases the dove, and when the dove returns to the ark with a branch, it shows that the destruction is over and new life is out there. So it's a hope in the resurrection on the graves of these people. Again, you have these hallways lined with loculi, but you also have cubicula, singular cubiculum, and this is where families would be buried together, and they're oftentimes beautifully decorated. So this is in the Catacombs of Santa Priscilla, and what you see is an orans figure. So orans is that gesture of prayer with upraised palms of a woman. And on the ceiling you see in this rondel, if you can see that it's the Good Shepherd, you see the sheep draped across his shoulders there. Yeah. So as I had mentioned, there are some slightly more covert images of Christ in the catacombs. Of course, we immediately associate the Good Shepherd with Christ because he says, I am the Good Shepherd. And that is the association here. However, this is also borrowing from an ancient Greco-Roman image of philanthropy, kind of a personification of the virtue of philanthropy. So the shepherd is the one who it symbolizes the Roman citizen who would take on the civic burden of another person onto his own shoulders. So a philanthropist, right? So that also it's an image that has its foot in both our Christian world to depict Christ and also within the Greco-Roman world, artistic world. We also see that the image of the Good Shepherd is surrounded by images of the Jonah cycle. And right here, I'll show you a closer up image, but is a peacock. There it is. So interestingly, in the Greco-Roman world, again, there was an association between the peacock and immortality. And that's why it's seen here. It's kind of a Christian baptizing of that image in order to indicate resurrection. So the peacock's flesh doesn't decay quickly when it dies. And so the ancients associated it with immortality, and here are the Christians adopting this type of imagery in a burial space to indicate their belief in bodily resurrection. Here again, another Good Shepherd in the center. And then if you can see here, I'll zoom into one of them. It's images from the Jonah story from the Old Testament. And this one, Jonah is quite dramatically exiting from the mouth of the whale, if you can see. There he is. And why would this particular biblical story be located in this burial chamber? It's because, as we know from the fathers who interpreted it in this way, just as Jonah spent 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so too Christ spends 3 in the belly of the earth and resurrects on the 3rd day. So the story of Jonah is a prototype of the resurrection of Christ. I think I'll skip this one because I did use it in my Pietà lecture, but it's the very earliest image of the Virgin Mary that we have. And she's breastfeeding Christ, and the prophet Balaam is pointing to a star over her head to indicate his prophecy that her progeny would rule over the house of Jacob forever. That's just a closer image. Another cubiculum. And I'm just zooming into a part of that cubiculum. I don't know if you immediately recognize what this is. I'll give you a second to look at it. But these 3 figures are approaching a woman with her child. So it's actually a depiction of the adoration of the Magi. Now, the adoration of the Magi, it's interesting because the catacombs, in terms of the imagery that's chosen to be depicted in the catacombs, oftentimes they'll focus on either symbols of the Christian faith, borrowed images from the pagan world that also correlate to Christian belief, like the peacock or the Good Shepherd, and theophanies. So we'll see a theophany like this, or for example, the 3 young men in the furnace is a popular image for the catacombs. That's because In that scriptural passage, it says one like a son of man is appearing with the three who are in the furnace. And it's this idea of a kind of a foretaste of the second person of the Trinity, who is revealing himself to these three young men long before the incarnation, right? So this is another theophany, a theophany from the New Testament. And it's, you see these three figures, and if the resolution is good enough, it's a bit hard to see, but they're wearing these pointed kind of peaked caps. So the peaked cap is the Phrygian cap. It, at this time in the Roman world, indicated a foreigner. It also had the added layer of indicating a freed man, so someone who had been freed from slavery. So what we see is three different colors. They're all foreigners. And the idea is that every nation on earth is coming to adore the face of God. So there's this final revelation of the face of God. It's interesting to think back to the Old Testament. Even people who did a lot for God didn't get to gaze upon his face. So for example, Moses, we know the famous story of he asked God to see his face, and instead God passes by with all his glory and Moses can only see his back parts. We have this longing in the Old Testament to gaze upon the face of God, right? Psalm 42, as a deer yearns for running streams, so I long for you. I long to see your face. Or Psalm 24, Lord, this is the people who longs to see your face. So there's this desire to gaze upon the face of God. And here is the culmination of that longing from the Old Testament. It's the revelation of the face of God to all the nations on earth, represented by these three people approaching, the three magi approaching Mary and the child Jesus. They're clearly indicated as foreigners, and there are three different colors representing everyone in the world, the Gentiles even, Jews and Gentiles, invited to see the face of God and gaze upon it. Here we have, this is Severa in Deo Vivas. It's just another marble slab. So this is Severa lives in God. And we have that image of the Magi. So the revelation of the face of God incarnate in Christ is a very popular one in the catacombs. So moving right along, because I would like to get to the and spend more time with Cosmas and Damian, which is our third stop, we're going to look at the first Christian church. So while the catacombs represented a church that was cast outside the city walls, outcast, persecuted, underground, hidden, we see here a major shift. So the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome is dedicated in 324 AD. And it's a gift of the Emperor Constantine to the church. So this property where the Basilica of St. John Lateran is located was his own private palace. So he had property there right along the city walls of Rome, and we'll see that illustrated here. And the significance of this is that in 313, just to give a little history, I'm just showing you exactly where it is, right on the city walls. This is the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Constantine met his rival Maxentius at the battle for the Milvian Bridge in 312. I'm sure this is a review for many of you, but I do want to at least make the point. So in 312, Constantine meets his rival Maxentius at the battle for the Milvian Bridge. The Milvian Bridge is it's really not that far outside of Rome. You can walk to it from the center of the city. It's a little bit of a hike, but it's just up the Tiber. And the night before the battle, church historian Eusebius recounts to us the story that Constantine had this vision of the cross, and underneath it said, "In this sign you will conquer." And so he emblazoned that image of the cross on the shields and insignia of his soldiers, and went into battle the next day against Maxentius and won. So he erects the Arch of Constantine, a victory arch it's right next to the Colosseum in Rome to this day. And he puts that image of the Chi-Rho and the cross on his victory arch to celebrate that victory. And he, in 313, will legalize Christianity for the first time in its 300 years of existence in the city of Rome. So he doesn't at that time make Christianity the official religion of the empire. However, it is legalized, and that means that Christians can finally own property. So this is the very first public Christian church in the world. This is St. John Lateran. You can see right here that these are the city walls of Rome. Of course, it's been largely added to. This facade is from 1735, but you can see that cross form is the original basilica. Oh, I wanted to bring this up. You might be asking, where were Christians worshiping if for the first 313 years they weren't allowed to own property? And so this is the answer. They used to worship in what's called the Domus Ecclesiae, or the house church. So Christians would, a Roman citizen who was in good standing with the empire would hold the title to a property, right? And if he kept his Christianity secret, he could, modify the structure of his house in order to accommodate Christian gatherings for the Mass. And it's actually because he holds the title for the property, it's where we get the word titular church. I don't know if you guys have heard of a titular church. There are many titular churches in Rome. Oftentimes a cardinal will be given a titular church in the city of Rome. These are the most ancient churches in the city, and it's someone who held the title to that property and secretly hosted the Christians, or was secretly Christian themselves, and allowed their house to be used as a domus ecclesiae, so a house church. So what's interesting here, this is an example of a house church from Dura Europos. So during those first 300 years, yes, Christians, we do have evidence that Christians did worship in the catacombs, but they mainly were worshiping in these type of spaces. But the problem here is that they had to modify someone's home in order to worship within it. So what I want to establish is, how did they do that? And then what kind of artistic and architectural decisions did they make and directions did they go in when they had the ability to create, design, and organize their own worship space? Because that will say a lot about what they believe about their God, their faith. They want to express their faith through the art and architecture of their churches when they have a chance to actually build their own. So this is what preceded that time. Someone would have to modify their house. Like right here, a wall has been knocked down to allow people to celebrate Mass. This is the section on the left where people are celebrating Mass. I find it very interesting that you have to enter from this, and it's symbolic to think that you must move through the baptistry in order to access any other part of this space. So there's a sense of the need for initiation into the Christian mysteries through baptism first, before you move on to this catechumenate teaching area and the assembly room. This particular house church is, parts of it are housed at Yale University Art Gallery. So I was fortunate enough to study it in person. It's from Dura Europos, which is in modern day Syria. And in 256, I believe, the 3rd century, Dura Europos, this city in modern day Syria, was a Roman outpost and stronghold. And it was attacked by the Sasanians. And in order to defend against the attack, the Romans pushed down the outer layer of buildings that lined the city walls in order to reinforce the city walls. they ended up failing. I mean, the city was overtaken and forgotten about for hundreds of years. But what was great about that for people in our day and age is that by pushing down that first layer of buildings into rubble to reinforce the city walls, they perfectly preserved all of the buildings that surrounded the city walls. And so what we found was this house church. We also found a mithraeum and a synagogue from a very, very early buildings, but very well preserved. So if you're ever at Yale University Art Gallery, you can go see this particular one. But this is how we worship. So I want to switch gears to think about, we're going to be looking at St. John Lateran. It's the very first public Christian church in the world. And Christians had to make a lot of decisions in the early 300s when Christianity is finally legalized and Christians have standing to own property and worship publicly. How are they going to create their worship space? What artistic and architectural decisions will they make to communicate who their God is to the outside world? So I thought about what were the typical worship spaces that they were amply familiar with within Rome. And the first has to be the Roman temple. I'm sure some of you have been to Rome, and you can't walk 10 steps in the city without bumping into a temple of some sort or the ruins of an ancient temple. So I wanted to point out some of the differences between the worship spaces that the Christians were really familiar with within the Roman Empire, and what decisions Christians made for their own worship spaces that differ to show us what they were trying to communicate about their God. So this is a temple. You see that there's an inner cella here with a huge statue of the god or goddess that's worshipped at this site. The cella is only accessible to the priests, so no one goes inside. The worshipers stay outside and they worship sub divos, so under the gods or under the heavens. Again, only priests are allowed inside. There's this windowless room, so it's dark and smaller inside. Typically, temples are heavily exteriorly decorated. Christian churches will, in the beginning, in the 300s, are not going to be heavily exteriorly decorated. They will be heavily interiorly decorated, and the exterior will be very plain. And that's for a purpose, and we'll get to that. So you also see that the Roman temple is raised up on a podium. Here's another podium. So there's this sense of separation between the gods and the people worshiping. A great separation. You don't enter the temple. There's a heavy exterior decoration and little interior decoration. And the priest would sacrifice an animal outside on the altar, and as they burned the sacrifice, the priest would recite a rather mathematically precise ritual prayer, and then bring some of that meat into the temple area, the cella, where other people were not allowed in. This is a very interesting site. So this is the temple to the divine Julius. It's in the Forum. And in 29 BC, Augustus, so Julius Caesar's great nephew, Augustus, deifies his great uncle, and he was something of an adoptive father. Julius Caesar was to Augustus. So Augustus deifies Julius Caesar, and he commissions Livy, Ovid, Virgil to write histories and poems in order to establish Julius Caesar as a god within the Roman pantheon. So this is his temple. There was a cult of worship set up around Julius Caesar after he had been deified by Augustus. And in turn, in 14 AD, when Augustus himself passed away, Augustus was then deified, brought to the level of a god, and he was worshipped. Augustus began to call himself the son of God, the son of the god. because his, great uncle Julius Caesar had been deified. And this began an interesting, it set a precedent really for all the emperors to become gods upon their death. And the current emperor would be called the son of God or the son of the god, right? So very interestingly and ironically, really, just around this time, so 14 AD is when Augustus dies, just around this time, Peter and Paul are entering the city of Rome and saying, not that men become gods, but that God has become man. And so to a Roman audience, it really flew in the face of what they were proclaiming about themselves. And immediately Christians had a target on their back. It's also interesting to note that how the gospel writers all were writing in different areas of the world, and it was the gospel writer Mark who was living in Rome and writing in Rome, his gospel. And he starts his gospel by saying, the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Now to us, that sounds very, we're used to hearing those words, but it would have pricked the ears of a Roman audience, because he says, first of all, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Gospel, we all know it means good news, glad tidings, but the word in Greek is evangelion, and that is associated with the good news that would be sent home from the Roman emperor if he was out on one of his military crusades. If he had a great victory, he would send a messenger back to Rome, transporting the evangelion, or the good news of that military victory for Rome. So immediately when Mark refers to the gospel of Jesus Christ, he's associating Jesus with to a Roman ear with something of a victorious emperor, right? Who's sending back good news of victory. And we also get the sense of it's the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. And he uses the word in Greek, it's 3 words, but huios tou theou, which means the son of the God, which is exactly what they were calling the Roman emperors, because the Roman emperors were serving, and were serving after they had deified their predecessors. So they were calling themselves the Son of God. So this language to a Roman ear, the good news of this victory of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, this is the true Son of God. Again, it goes against what the Romans are out there saying, that men are becoming gods. So Christians they have a rough time of it in this atmosphere and within this kind of belief system of the Roman Empire. Okay, so that was the first worship space that Christians would have been amply familiar with. They also would have been amply familiar with the Mithraeum. So there are hundreds of Mithraea across Rome. I don't know if any of you have heard of the cult of Mithras. Mithras is a Persian god. You see him here slaying the primogenital bull on this altar. The cult of Mithras was a mystery religion. So the difference between a mystery religion and an organized religion is that mystery religions don't write about themselves. So it's very difficult since we don't have any writings from them, to ascertain exactly what they believed. However, we do know that they were all across the Roman Empire, but you find them as far as Ireland. They were all over Rome, and this was extraordinarily popular. They also had a lot of very wealthy Romans who were part of the cult of Mithras. For example, Emperor Hadrian was part of the cult of Mithras. So that said, they had the funds, let's just say, to have any type of worship space they wanted. They could have worshiped in a stadium if they wanted. They had those type of connections and that type of money backing them. However, they chose to worship in these cave-like small structures, no windows, You can see these benches on either side. They would have fit about, that's just a close-up of Mithras, about 24 men reclining to eat, because there would be a sacrifice of an animal in the center of the room. About 24 men could at one time participate in the mysteries of the cult of Mithras. They were also exclusive to men, and there were, I think, 7 stages of initiation into the cult. So this is really not what the Christians are going to go for, even though this type of worship space was all over the city of Rome. It's something that's exclusive, and the Christians have a God who's saying, go therefore baptize and make disciples of all nations, right? So they can't have some type of exclusive space that's too small to fit too many people. And they also are going to want to not have it be so cave-like. They want to incorporate light. Christ has said he's the light of the world. So we'll see something very different with the Christian church and what they decide upon. Okay, this is a little bit more like it. The Jewish synagogue. So this is an example of a Jewish synagogue from the 1st century AD. So around, the time that the Christians were also within the Roman Empire. We see that the Jewish synagogue, it shows a little bit more of what the Christians are going to be looking for when they finally get to design and organize their own worship space for the first time. First of all, you see a sense of direction, axiality, and destination. So you'd enter through this door into the synagogue, and immediately you're oriented towards this niche. It's the Torah niche. So the scriptures were kept within the Torah niche. Usually there was a candle outside of the Torah niche, and there's at least a sense of the presence of God in the space, at least through his word being present here. So a sacredness and a sense of presence within the space, a direction and an axiality, the whole building is pointed towards Jerusalem. There's plenty of space inside, and there's plenty of light. So this is the type of building that Christians settle on to create their very, very first churches. And I think it's so significant, their choices architecturally, to communicate their belief about God through art and architecture. So the basilica plan, a basilica is not unique to the Christians by any means. So the basilica is an architectural type that was developed by the Greeks in the 4th century BC. They called it the basileos, which literally means royal walkway. So what you would do, this is how the Greeks used it. There's an exterior atrium. Then you would walk down this central aisle. You would greet the ruler, so that's why it's called a royal walkway. Greet the ruler in the apse, who would be seated here. Pay your obeisance, meet with him, and then exit out either one of the side aisles or the transept. So this is not how the Romans used the basilica, not as a royal walkway. The Romans took the idea of the basilica and built them all over Rome, and they opened up doors on the sides. These dots are representing columns. They opened up doors on the sides so that there wasn't that axiality to the building. And they had civic offices within basilicas. They had marketplaces within basilicas. This was a center of, it was a hub of human, the marketplace, communication, legal offices, all of that sort of thing. So for the Christians, there were so many basilicas around the city of Rome already, and they were easily transferable and modifiable into the space that the Christians wanted to use for their worship space. And they didn't have any religious connotations, which was important. These are the very first basilica churches in Rome. We see the clerestory windows let in a ton of light. One of my favorite art historians calls them big old barns, just because they can welcome in so many hundreds and thousands of people inside. And I'm sure if you've been to Rome and have seen some of these places, you just feel tiny in this immense space. They're huge. So there's light, they welcome people in, they're communicating something of the Christian God. There's also this axiality and direction. So you can see that as you enter in, you're oriented towards the nave. So the Christians reintroduce that axiality of the building that the Romans had taken away. And instead of being a royal walkway towards an earthly ruler, Eusebius, a church historian, calls this the heavenly walkway towards Christ. So you're entering into the nave and greeting Christ, who's on, confected in the Eucharist, is present on the altar during Mass. You have a ton of light streaming in. Again, that idea of Christ as the light of the world. Here's another view of that. Here's the apse of the church where their altar would be. Okay, this is another important point. I had mentioned that the Roman temples were heavily exteriorly decorated. This is Santa Sabina, roughly contemporaneous, comes a little bit later than St. John Lateran, because St. John Lateran is the first. However, it gives a better sense of what St. John Lateran would have looked like when it was constructed. So these days, a lot of Baroque additions have been added to the church of the exterior structure and interior of John Lateran. But this shows what it might have looked like back when it was dedicated in 324 AD. You see that it's just a wooden thatched roof and a kind of plain brick exterior. And I'll show you here just the cross part. This would be the wooden thatched roof section and a rather plain brick exterior. This is John Lateran. If you can imagine, you'd walk in the Porta Latina. This is a major entryway into the city of Rome. Here are the walls of Rome. You might turn the corner and think, gosh, that's a funny place for a warehouse. They looked like, another art historian calls them aurea, the big Roman warehouses. They're kind of nondescript. You would have no idea the types of, the jewel box that's inside these places. So that's also on purpose, as opposed to the pagan Roman temples that are heavily exteriorly decorated. The Christians wanted to express something about who Christ is by creating their churches in this way. Christ became man, he took on flesh. There's this humble exterior, but when you enter in, it's this jewel box of mosaics and light reflecting off them and beauty in this almost like ethereal realm that you're transported to. So that's the significance, to show Christ, whose humanity makes him look humble, and it almost disguises this incredible divinity that's within, right? So church historian Eusebius, I really love what he has to say about John Lateran, because he lived through the persecution of Diocletian. So that was the last major persecution. There was one after Constantine with Julian the Apostate, but for the last major persecution before the legalization of Christianity was Diocletian. This is when Cosmas and Damian died. They were beheaded. Eusebius lived through it, and he wrote, I can imagine with tears in his eyes, about the dedication of John Lateran. The emperor has become Christian and is legalizing Christianity, and he's dedicating this church. He goes on to describe 111 golden chandeliers. He talks about the fact that the tiny little tesserae, the tiny pieces of golden colored glass that make up the mosaics in John Lateran, they're set into the wall at different angles, and the light from the clerestory windows is hitting them and creating this shimmering effect that enlivens the walls and makes it look like you're beholding this otherworldly vision of heaven. So he's just absolutely over the moon to be able to witness that transformation from a time of horrible, violent persecutions to the dedication of the first in the world public Christian church. I'm just showing you that very plain exterior here. This is from 1735. It's the facade. It was added again much later, but it indicates that Christ is the Savior. This church is dedicated to Christ the Savior. And it also has a plaque that calls John Lateran the head and mother church of all churches in the city and in the world. This is to indicate its very important status. And as you can see here, the exterior might have been plain, but the interior is really like a jewel box. I wanted to show you a picture with someone standing in it so that you could get that sense of scale. And I love this apse mosaic. So this is at the very end of the church. It's the focal point of the church. You can see that. Okay, so this upper section dates back to the 4th century, so it is original. Some of the lower section has been redone and restored. But what I want to emphasize to you is, remember in the catacombs, we saw again and again this image of the Magi. It's so popular in the catacombs, the 3 people approaching Mary and Jesus to finally behold the face of God. And so much of the art in the catacombs is slightly more covert. You have more symbols. Here you have Christ's face completely overt in the light. It's the focal point of the entire church. And this mosaic dates back to that time when the church was dedicated. So it's this victory for the Christians who had to be hidden, couldn't have public worship space, that finally the face of Jesus is there for everyone to see. It's bathed in light. It's not hidden behind symbols or anything like that. It must have been such a sense of victory and celebration at that time. And I also wanted to point out, I had mentioned that there's this echoing longing throughout the pages of the Old Testament, this longing to gaze upon the face of God, and no one can look upon the face of God and live, right? And I thought it was interesting to see the 2 deers here, and they're drinking from the 4 rivers of paradise that are streaming down from beneath this crux gemata, so the jeweled cross of victory. And it's a reference to Psalm 42, which says, as a deer yearns for running streams, so I long for you, I long to see your face. So this culmination in the incarnation of Jesus, to be able to gaze upon the face of God and live. And now that Christians are no longer being persecuted, they can put that face of Christ in the light for everyone to see as the focal point of the first public Christian church in the world. These, the red clouds, they're actually representative of the seraphim. The seraphim are called the fiery ones. So it's the gathering of the heavenly hosts, the angelic hosts, in the presence of God. Okay, perfect. I'm excited to get to the virtual tour. So this is our 3rd stop. I said we'd span 500 years, the first 500 years of Christianity within the city of Rome. We'd see that age of persecution, topographically represented by the catacombs, this, being outside of the city walls. Then we move into the legalization of Christianity in 313 by Constantine, and he gives them the first public Christian church of St. John Lateran. And finally, this is the final step in this development and movement of Christianity into the very heart of the Roman Empire, and that's represented by the Basilica of Cosmas and Damian. So I'll show you where it is. So we move from the outskirts to just on the city walls with John Lateran, and finally to the heart of the Roman Forum. So the Roman Forum was, again, the legislative, administrative, and religious epicenter of the Roman Empire. It's the main street of the capital city of the entire Roman Empire. It's the heart of the world in their mind, right? Although we would say Jerusalem is the heart of the world, but at any rate. So the fact that Christians would have a church On the Via Sacra, that's like getting real estate on Fifth Avenue. I mean, it's a huge deal. And coming from where the Christians had been to from persecutions to 10 waves of persecutions to the point of having property on the Via Sacra in the Roman Forum, complete change. And over 500 years, and I know that sounds like a long time, but it's actually not. It's an astounding victory for the Christians. Okay, so I'm going to switch out of my presentation briefly to go into the virtual tour, but I did want to show you that this is the Church of Cosmas and Damian. Here, this road that people are sitting on, that is the Via Sacra. It's ancient Rome's main street. It's where all of the temples were located, not all of them, but many of the most major ones. It goes through the heart of the Roman Forum. This is the Basilica building where the church is housed. It used to be like a kind of like a conference center for the Romans. And this is the vestibule, this round space is the vestibule of the Basilica of Cosmas and Damian. But it used to be the temple of Valerius Romulus, who was the deified son of the Emperor Maxentius. So if you can think of the irony here of a building that this vestibule was once dedicated to a man who had been deified, who had become a god, and now it's dedicated to the Christian God, the God who became man. All right, I'm just showing you that it's very much in the heart of the Roman Forum. Here it is. Here it is, and you can just see that the Colosseum is right behind it. You can see my mouse, right? Okay, here it is. So, I mean, the Roman Senate is right here, and here's Cosmas and Damian. All right, let me get out of this quickly and go into the virtual tour. Okay, so I had a lot of fun. I was up in like a 50-foot lift to be up this high, taking pictures and doing scanning. This is the interior of Cosmas and Damian. And let's see, I'll show you just a sec. What we're gonna be looking at is I scanned the basilica itself, and then the atrium, which you see here, and some of the other rooms. And then I also scanned the lower floor, right. So it's interesting to note that the basilica actually flooded at one point. The Cloaca Maxima, which is the sewer that, you know, services the Roman Forum, which still works to this day, which is amazing because the Romans built it many centuries ago. It got clogged at one point, and the church flooded on its lower layer. So they had to raise the level of the floor by 20 feet. That was in the 1600s. Let me go back to... So if you're down here, this used to be the level of the church that you would actually stand on. This is Cosmas and Damian. You would be looking up at that mosaic from this level. So that's the floor plan there. Okay. This is the atrium. It's lined by scenes from the life of Saint Francis of Assisi. Franciscans have lived in the Basilica of Cosmas and Damian and its surrounding areas for about 500 years. So you're going to see a lot of Franciscan art. There we go. What I found interesting was to, hold on one second. Let me get back up to that image of the, there we go. This is the mosaic. What you see is, so first of all, this mosaic is incredible because it is from the 500s. It's original. There's been some restorative work, like you can see with Pope Felix here, that he's been more heavily restored, but these other images have not been. They're incredible examples of 6th century art. You see Christ coming in glory. He's holding the rotulus, or the scroll, which indicates that he is the Word made flesh. He's wearing a Roman senator's toga, as are Peter and Paul. Let me see if... You can see that, well, I'll get to this in a second. Let me move out for here. All right. Yes, this is a good view. We have Christ coming in glory. As I had mentioned, those fiery clouds, the seraphim are called the fiery ones. Those are the seraphim. The blue are representative of the cherubim. So the gathering of the angelic hosts around Christ. We see on this side, the left-hand side, Paul, also wearing a Roman senator's toga. It's interesting because we're a stone's throw, literally a stone's throw away from the Roman Senate. We also have Peter on this side, and the two of them are ushering in the saints Cosmas and Damian. And what's interesting is that let me just zoom in a little here. You can see that they have these little bags, the bags of travelers, the shoes of travelers, the cloaks of travelers. They have darker complexions than Peter and Paul. These are, most people think that they're from Arabia, Cosmas and Damian. I've heard it argued that they're from Turkey. They're coming from the East. They're foreigners. That's indicated by their darker complexion. They have these traveling clothes and the bags. Their hands are covered. It's a sign of obeisance, or like deference to an emperor, to offer gifts. And what they're offering are these crowns of martyrdom. So in the ancient world, if you won an Olympic game, or you were an emperor and you had a military battle that you were victorious with, you would be gifted a crown of laurels and a long palm branch, and it was the symbol of victory. So you'll always see the martyrs carrying crowns and oftentimes palm branches to symbolize their victory. You also see, this is Pope Felix. He's the Pope at the time who commissioned this one of the most major building projects of the 6th century was the creation of this church, turning that Roman basilica and temple to the divine Romulus into a Christian basilica on the Via Sacra. It was a huge building project, and he's offering a model of Cosmas and Damian to Christ. On the other side, we see Saint Theodore, and he is the namesake of King Theodoric, who allowed for this building project to happen. And he also was killed, as were Cosmas and Damian, in Emperor Diocletian's persecution. I also think it's interesting to look at, let's see here. This is the Jordan River right here. And you see Christ, who's represented in the center as a lamb. See, he has that tiny cross over his head. He's standing on this hill, kind of like Mount Zion, where the 4 rivers of paradise are flowing out from it. And he's surrounded by the 12 apostles, who are pictured as these lambs, who are kind of converging upon that central figure of Christ. Then you see, this is Jerusalem, a representation of the city of Jerusalem, and a representation on the other side of Bethlehem right here. So there's that emphasis on the city where Christ entered the world and the city where he left it. You can see Felix. Oh, and this is also interesting. So here there's this palm tree. You see this bird? I was puzzled by that when the first time I saw it. It's a phoenix. So again, borrowing from some imagery from the ancient Roman, Greco-Roman pagan world. The Christians are using the phoenix, which rises up from the ashes into new life, as a symbol of resurrection. Let's see here. You can see the mosaics quite up close. It's very pretty. And again, Cosmas and Damian, this is St. Theodorus. We would say Theodore. Cosmas and Damian were twin brothers. They were also physicians. So they're the patron saints of physicians and dentists. And let's just go back down to floor level here. They were twins, and I just thought it was very interesting that they picked twins to depict here in the forum, because again, a stone's throw away, you have the Palatine Hill, where in 753, Romulus and Remus traditionally founded the city of Rome. Twins, right? Romulus and Remus. And then just across the street from Cosmas and Damian is the temple of Castor and Pollux. They're twin Roman gods. So it's interesting to see that this church was chosen to be dedicated to Cosmas and Damian, twin brothers. It's almost as if we're baptizing the Roman fascination with twinning. You also can see, here, I'll go back up to this level, right. The Lamb of God, this is Jesus, as the Lamb as one who was slain, sitting on this jeweled throne. This is an image from the book of Revelation. He has the scroll with the 7 seals in front of him. The 7 lampstands or candlesticks from, again, referenced in the book of Revelation, referring to the different cities. You see angels, you see the elders with that gesture of deference and obeisance, covering their hands to lift up the crowns. And you also see, unfortunately, this happens so much in Rome. During the Baroque period, a lot of that ancient 6th century mosaic was cut in order to make room for some Baroque art, because they didn't have that sense of, as much of the sense of preserving the past that we do. So preserving, the artistic works of the past. So we have only 2 of the gospel writers pictured. There would have been all 4. But as you know, in the book of Ezekiel, and again in Revelation, we have the 4 living creatures that we associate with the gospel writers. So the winged creatures with, the head of the man, the eagle, the ox, and the lion. And so we see here the eagle. This is John. The eagle indicates that he soars to the heights of theology. He begins his gospel by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So he's talking about Christ before he takes on human flesh. And then on the other side, we see Matthew's gospel. You see he's holding this book of the Gospels, and that's the face of the man, because Matthew begins his gospel not with that high theology of Christ before the incarnation that John does, right? He begins his gospel with what? Something we hear at the Christmas liturgy, the genealogy of Christ. So his human history, his human predecessors, we hear their names listed in that long gospel of the genealogy. Those are the first words of Matthew's gospel. So here he is. I also wanted to point out, this first chapel here is dedicated to Francis, because this church is under the, it's owned by Franciscans and has been for the past 500 years. Up in this frieze above these chapels, you see some of the images from the life of Cosmas and Damian. So for example, here they are being beheaded. You can also see, let's see, in this chapel, a preserved image from the lower church that we saw before the floor was raised due to the flood. And what I really love about it is that it shows Christ, whoops. It's from the 8th century, and it shows Christ on the cross. However, He's dressed in the imperial purple robe, and he's wearing a crown. So this imperial purple, purple is the color of royalty, and there's this deep association with, it's the emperor, the Roman emperor, who will wear this purple color. You have to crush these seashells, thousands of them, specific ones off the coast of Italy, in order to get this purple dye that they use for the imperial cloth, and it's extraordinarily expensive. So Christ is dressed as an emperor. His eyes are open, although he's also crucified. So it's in one image showing his death and resurrection. He's still alive, and he's king of the universe, emperor of everything, the true emperor, right? That's clearly communicated here. I also wanted to mention that the Franciscans, since they own this building, you see some Franciscan touches. Francis was the first person to have the manger scene. He kind of invented having a Christmas creche. He also started passion plays during Lent. So whenever you see a creche at Christmas, you can thank him. But I thought it's very neat to see that right here, there's this beautiful Neapolitan, so from Naples, creche scene within the Church of Cosmas and Damian. There it is. You can see how intricate it is. It's interesting to see that life continuing on as always, and in the center of it, the incarnation and the nativity. One other note that I just wanted to make was I embedded some information in here for my students. And I want to show you two things that I embedded for them. So first of all, one of the Franciscans who lives at Cosmas and Damian currently, a lovely friar, and he gave me all of this 6th century Roman chant so that I could, he said, you need to listen to what the liturgy sounded like during this time in front of these mosaics when they were first this building was first turned into a church. So I'm going to let you all listen to just a second of ancient Roman 6th century chant. It's going to sound very Eastern because there are a lot of melismas and a drone, but this is Roman chant from the time of the building of this church. It's the Kyrie from the Mass. Whoop. Whenever I move away, it turns off.
Kyrie eleison.
I'll stop it there. I hope you enjoyed it. There's just a repertoire of ancient Roman chant that we still have to this day, and to think that that was what people were hearing at the opening of the Mass while they looked at these mosaics when they were brand new is just quite striking. Another aspect of this that I wanted to share is something a little more modern. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Thomas Merton. He was a Trappist monk. He passed away, fairly recently, but was active towards the end of the 20th century, especially with his writings. Right. So he came to Rome as an 18-year-old before he was Christian or Catholic. And he saw this mosaic that we're looking at, and he was so struck by it that it led to him buying a Bible, and that led to his conversion. So he writes about his first time seeing this mosaic, and I just find this so fascinating. I'm not going to read you the whole thing. Let's see. Okay. So this is from his famous book, The Seven-Story Mountain. He's in Rome as an 18-year-old traveling around. He says, "Things were going on as they usually did with me, but after about a week," he's in Rome, "I don't know how it began, I found myself looking into churches rather than into ruined temples. Perhaps it was the frescoes on the wall of an old chapel, ruined too at the foot of the Palatine at the edge of the Forum, that first aroused my interest in another and far different Rome. From there, it was an easy step to Saints Cosmas and Damian across the Forum, with a great mosaic in the apse of Christ coming in judgment in a dark blue sky, with a suggestion of fire in the small clouds beneath his feet. The effect of this discovery was tremendous. After all the vapid, boring, semi-pornographic statuary of the empire, what a thing it was to come upon the genius of an art full of spiritual vitality and earnestness and power. An art that was tremendously serious and alive and eloquent and urgent in all that it had to say. And it was without pretentiousness, without fakery, and had nothing theatrical about it. Its solemnity was made all the more astounding by its simplicity, and by the obscurity of the places where it lay hid, and by its subservience to higher ends, architectural, liturgical, and spiritual ends that I could not even begin to understand, but which I could not avoid guessing, since the nature of the mosaics themselves and their position and everything about them proclaimed it aloud. I was fascinated by these Byzantine mosaics. I began to haunt the churches where they were to be found, and as an indirect consequence, all the other churches that were more or less of the same time period. Thus, without knowing anything about it, I became a pilgrim. And now, for the first time in my life, I began to find out something of who this person was that men call Christ. It was obscure, but it was a true knowledge of him, in some sense, truer than I knew and truer than I would admit. But it was in Rome that my conception of Christ was formed. It was there that I first found him, whom I now serve as my God and my King, and who owns and rules my life." I love that quote from Burton and the effect that the mosaic and other similar mosaics in Rome had on him. He said that it made him, unbeknownst to himself even, a pilgrim. And he said that it's art that's full of spiritual vitality, that he recognized that it had a liturgical significance, a theological significance, a deeper meaning, right? So I won't go through these slides because we did go through the interior, although they are quite beautiful. You'd think that that's not something that's from the 6th century, wouldn't you? It looks modern in a way. I wanted to conclude with this point. So we see here on the right-hand side, the basilica that we were just exploring, the Church of Cosmas and Damian. We see that it's here on the Via Sacra. So it was dedicated in 525, 200 years after John Lateran had been dedicated. Now, John Lateran was the first public Christian church, and slowly but surely, St. Mary Major was built in the 400s. That's on the Esquiline Hill. It's moving closer to the heart of Rome, but it's not really there yet. And there was a faction of Romans who were not Christian who adamantly opposed the symbolic presence of Christianity in the heart of the Roman Forum. They said, absolutely not, this can never happen. And so it was a great victory for the Christians to have the Church of Cosmas and Damian built and dedicated in 525. So 1,000 years later in 1500, or around about 1500, a little later than that, but 1,000 years later, Michelangelo is living in the city of Rome. He had just finished painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling and was assigned yet another project. He was asked to redesign this space right here. Do you see it? It's the top of the Capitoline Hill. Now, the Capitoline Hill was of extraordinary importance in ancient Rome because it was the hill that was covered in temples, all facing down into the Forum towards the Church of Cosmas and Damian. They were temples dedicated to the Roman pantheon, and they faced down into this heart of the world, this epicenter of the Roman Empire in the Forum. So what Michelangelo does in his redesign, here's a little bit of a close-up of it, is very interesting. He reorients that entire square to turn its back on the Roman Forum, which again is the center of the world to the Romans, right? Here it is, it's not facing, it's turning away from, reorienting away from the Roman Forum. He puts Castor and Pollux, these are representations of these twin gods, Castor and Pollux, on either side. And again, they're turning their back towards ancient pagan Rome. Here you can see them again. And if you were to go up above the rooftops to look at what they're facing, you would see the Dome of St. Peter's. So there's this idea that Michelangelo is putting into place. Castor and Pollux, these twin Roman gods, they're turning their back on ancient Rome, kind of putting it in the past and setting their sights on the future of Christian Rome. And in particular, you have these two monumental statues of Peter and Paul in St. Peter's Square that they're facing towards. So these Roman gods, Castor and Pollux, they turn their back on pagan Rome, look forward to the Christian city. And it's this Christian city that's founded by the quote unquote twins of Peter and Paul under the headship of Christ. Here he is above them, who is the true Huios tou Theou, the Son of God, the true emperor. So there's this movement in Rome from Christianity being cast out of the city to coming under the leadership, ultimately, of Christ as a Christian city. And that's what the point that I wanted to explain, and I hope that you enjoyed the travels from one part of the city into the other and got something out of this first 500 years of faith in Rome as illustrated by the art and architecture of the city. And I'm happy to grant access to the, for you to just explore the Church of Cosmas and Damian. I can send a link.
Amy, why don't you send that to me and I'll get it to everybody by email. So that will be great if you want to go back or take your children around. And there's lots of more educational material embedded in there. But wow, what, can we have a round of applause for Amy? Wasn't that amazing? You know, you're all muted, so I'm applauding for all of you. I just realized that. But Amy, you know, we have comments ranging from this should be in front of every Catholic school children in America to why don't we send Amy on a Benedict XVI Legatus tour which is a kind of club for affluent Catholics who run companies. So we'll be talking with you some more. And I thank you. And we are so pleased that Amy is with us. She mentioned we will be talking about the project after Andrew Galvin, who is here to talk tell us about St. Junipero Serra. The project that Amy is doing for us right now as senior fellow. First of all, she is creating a virtual reality version and tour of the Cathedral of St. Mary's. Shout out to Maura Konzelman, who helped make that possible. And also the Bishop Barbara has asked her to do the Cathedral of Christ the Light. So those are two very new churches, but both of them in their way architecturally significant, and of course, core here to Bay Area Catholics. But she has already started work on the project, which Phil Hunder and the Louise M. Davies Foundation helped us get off the ground, is doing the same thing with all the mission churches founded by Junipero Serra. And then if we can attract the patrons who would support this work, really, we would like to do all of the mission churches, including at least one of them in Baja California, which he himself helped build with his own hands. So I particularly have my eyes on that one. But thank you. And let me go to participants so I can make sure I find Andrew. I think if you speak, you will be highlighted. Are you with us, Andrew?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. So Andrew Galvin, who is one part of the spiritual lineage of St. Junipero Serra himself personally, and also knows a lot because he's the curator of Mission Dolores. Welcome, and we're so anxious to hear about this great saint.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to be with you today. Amy gave a good segue for me to start out by using the example of the twins, Peter and Paul. Because Mission Dolores, the first Mass in San Francisco, is on June 29th, which is the feast day of Peter and Paul. And our two twins that are California are, of course, Junipero Serra and his student who ends up being his biographer, Fray Francisco Palau. Both of them come from Majorca, Spain, to this part of the world. They minister in Mexico, and then they both come up to California. Palau was our actually first permanent resident padre at Mission Dolores, and it is he who writes the biography of Junipero Serra after Serra dies, because he wanted to put down for the people of Majorca specifically what the great son of Majorca had done in this new world that they had come to. And so in San Francisco, as throughout California, at the 9 Serra missions, and Maggie, you're correct, there are 10. Often people just record history at the border, but we know that Junipero Serra established one mission in Baja before he comes north into Upper or Alta California. And so we have the 9 missions that are now part of the state of California, part of the United States of America. And that's how we proclaim Junipero Serra to be among the founding fathers of the United States, because he established California, our golden state, that his influence is upon us. I haven't heard anything yet. You know, we've suffered the removal of statues and plaques. I haven't seen anything yet where somebody wants to take the map of California and change all the Christian saint names that Serra painted. Sometimes I've heard he painted a scroll for Christ on the map of California. It's a litany of saints from San Diego almost to the Oregon border. And what a difficulty that would be if people come up with a movement to change all those names. So we begin with Junipero Serra coming across the border from Baja or Old California, Viejo California, into Nuevo California. Those are the terms he knew, Old California and New California during his time. Some people ask, why is July 1st his feast day and not August 28th, the day he died? Well, August 28th, when we were in Rome, at the time before his beatification, when we were participating in the vote for the miracle of Sister Mary Boniface Drida, Franciscan sister, who was cured through the intercession of Junipero Serra in 1960, the Congregation of Saints asked, what would be a good day for his feast day? And because everybody kind of shook their heads and said, no, you're not getting August 28th. We're not bumping St. Augustine. So we went back to historical notes, and it became very quickly, very clearly, what would be a perfect day for Junipero Serra's feast day. The day he enters Upper California, July the 1st. And that's why his feast day is July the 1st. That's the day that he steps across the border. I like to say that's the day he steps across the border as the first undocumented illegal alien coming into this country. So he very much is a patron saint of all Californians, and as he is a patron saint for all of us. So his life and ministry is one of bringing people to the faith. He's a student at John Duns Scotus, and that understanding of philosophy and theology is that all creation is innocent and pure, and Junipero Serra's journey is to get to a place that he called, and many of his time contemporaries called it the forest, which means getting to a place that they're entering the Garden of Eden because the gospel has never been brought there. And that's why on July the 1st, it's documented that when they get to what the soldiers and the padres knew as the border between Upper and Lower California, Junipero Serra inquires, am I now in Upper California? And basically he gets off his donkey, gets down and kisses the ground, because this is his lifelong journey, his lifelong dream to bring the gospel to a place, to a people who had never heard it proclaimed before. And so the ministry of that same moment continues in all of our churches in California, especially our missions, is proclaiming the gospel that Amy so beautifully put together as told through the various churches in Rome that many of us, I've had the opportunity many times to visit most of those places. And it was wonderful, Amy, to see all the artwork and to have you bring in the historical documentation as well as the scriptures. And as we visit our California missions, we also bring in the scriptures. We bring in, as we bring people in, because the major thing that Junipero Serra was doing was he was baptizing native peoples into the Christian faith. Now, as we know, before, when was it? Before 1910, 11, when Pope Pius X changed the order of the sacraments of initiation, it was baptism, then confirmation, then Eucharist, and then it got changed that he put Eucharist in the middle for the young children to receive. If you look to the historical records of our California mission, after baptism, what is the biggest sacramental push that Junipero Serra is doing? And that is to get to every single mission to confirm the indigenous peoples. He had received the permission from the congregation in Rome, because he was in missionary country and there were no bishops here, that he could administer the sacrament of confirmation. And what he was doing was he was preparing the native peoples to be in full communion for the moment when he was given permission to bring the Eucharist and to distribute Eucharist to the native peoples. My ancestors were at these missions. And so I see Junipero Serra as the person who brought the gospel into our land, and specifically brought the gospel and the message of Christ to my family, both at Mission Dolores and at Mission San Jose, which is on the East Bay. My favorite spots are to sit near the baptismal fonts, because I know, I can stand on the front doors of these buildings and I can talk about colonialism and the horrible things that happen to people when one country invades another country. But then I can swing the doors open to either one of those mission churches. I can walk people down the aisle to where the baptismal fonts are, and I can say, here is where my ancestors first became Christians. Now, I know there are many immigrant people in the state of California and where your other folks may be in your home states that immigrated from other countries. And there's often an exciting trip if a family returns to Ireland or to Italy or some other country and says, here's where my ancestors were married the day before they got on the boat, before they went across the ocean to get to Ellis Island, and then they come to San Francisco. I don't have to go anywhere. All I got to do is walk down the street, and I'm right there where my ancestors became Christians. And it's in the record books. And so for many people, that's why I say, if you can't do the touchstone journey, just as St. Francis did with his visual aids, the Christmas crutch and with the Stations of the Cross, Francis set up all those imageries and all those spiritual events so that people who could not make the journey to the Holy Land to go to Bethlehem, or who could not get to Jerusalem, who could not get to Calvary, through the worship service, by looking and meditating and adoring at a Christmas scene, or by practicing the spiritual practice of the Stations of the Cross, he found a way for the people to understand those things that people were making long journey pilgrimages on. He brought the pilgrimage home. And so there are many ways, if people go on a pilgrimage to a California mission, they can see what the Franciscan friars, who are rooted in the Christian tradition, were doing, trying to bring the native peoples to those holy places in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem. It's the same thing. It's that same message that every Christian follower hears, that we know we hear Jesus says to the apostles, that St. Francis of Assisi says to his disciples, that Junipero Serra said to his missionaries, go and baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So when we come to our missions, they become places, spiritual places, where a pilgrimage can be made. And especially you see me framed right there with the interior of Mission Dolores, which Amy's coming tomorrow to take our visual tour up. And all the statues are there. They were the visual aids that the padres used to teach my ancestors the Christian faith. And pretty much because there weren't books, there weren't PowerPoint presentations, there wasn't any internet 250 years ago, but there was the art, the paintings, and the statues. And here's one thing about our California artwork in our missions. Many of the missions, the artwork is 200 or 300 years older than the actual building. Reason being is this, and I'll give you the exclusion, that's San Francisco. San Francisco, we have no artwork that is older than our building. And that reason is, Junipero Serra said, this mission is dedicated to our founder of the order, St. Francis of Assisi. So only new stuff came to San Francisco. But at the other missions, as churches in Mexico 250 years ago or a little later were getting new church altar vestments for the priest, they were getting new books, or they were getting new statues. They would do like perhaps you and I would do as we pack up our used clothes, our old books, and send off to the Goodwill, to St. Vincent de Paul Society. So from Mexico, they would pack up the old statues, the old vestments, the older chalices, and send them up to the mission country. And so the antiquity of many of our artifacts in our California missions are older than the missions themselves, except for St. Francisco, because Father Serra said only new stuff for St. Francis. So there's a tradition in using the art, as Amy just so beautifully showed us, and expressing our faith, in teaching our religion. Because I often think of my ancestors looking at the various statues and one or two padres trying to explain the Blessed Trinity. We have a painting there at Mission Dolores that has Jesus as a triplet. There's one in Santa Clara Mission too, on the ceiling of Old Mission Santa Clara, that there's Jesus in a red robe, or a figure in a red robe. That's supposed to be the Holy Spirit. Then there's one in blue, and that's Jesus. Then one in white, and that's God. But if you look at the faces, it's Jesus as a triplet. Imagine if you're a native person, a California Indian who came into a mission, who had your own religious system before, you're trying to figure this out, and somebody's explaining to you the Trinity using one of these paintings. Sometimes I just figure, I'm sure one of my ancestors must have asked the padre, could you explain that again? And then, you know, there's a statue. Every Franciscan mission, pretty much you can tell it's a Franciscan mission if there's a statue of the Immaculate Conception in it. Because the Franciscan friars, until 1854, when Pope Pius IX declared the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, the Franciscans took a special promise to promulgate the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. So we know a Franciscan church because when you look at the main altar, you're going to see a statue of the Immaculata. So when you look at our California missions, and some people go, why is that mission down there by Solvang called La Purísima Concepción, the most precious or the most pure conception? Because the dogma of the Immaculate Conception had not yet been promulgated when Mission La Purísima is set up. So there's also a play on words that the friars are trying to keep it in play, but they didn't want to violate the rules of the time. So by studying and visiting and praying at our California missions, especially through our art and through the different traditions that continued there, if you come to Mission Dolores and if you go to many of our California missions, you won't find any Stations of the Cross hanging on the walls inside the churches, because that was a Franciscan tradition that the Stations of the Cross were the way, the road to Calvary, and generally they're outside in a place where people can walk a distance from each station to the next station. And so we see these traditions, the Franciscan traditions, continued in our California missions. And then, yes, there becomes the big situation where people can talk about the conversion of native peoples. How did the Indians come into the missions? What were the techniques that the friars used? And the friars always said their first method for converting Indians was friendship, to reach out, the exchange of gifts. There was one slide there, can't remember which church it was, Amy, where you had them bringing gifts. Remember the two people?
The Magi bringing gifts.
Yeah, the Magi were bringing gifts. And the Padres shared that they brought gifts. And in the same time, the Padres then write down, and the native peoples reciprocated. It was then, once they were gift giving, that then they could exchange the faith. And so there's much into this sense of what we call hospitality. Well, most of our native peoples either have been converted or not converted to this day, but at each one of our missions up and down the state, which means then through all our churches up and down the state, the ministry needs to continue following that example of the Franciscan friars of reaching out and sharing gifts. And the response of my ancestors and other native peoples was to reciprocate with gifts, because we have that in the documentation that the Indians would be bringing food and all these other necessary things as the early missions were setting up for the military and for the soldiers for survival. And then we continue our story. The challenge today in the state of California is the same challenge Junipero Serra had 2 centuries ago. How do I bring the Christian message to people? How do we get people inside our church buildings? How do we minister to them? And eventually is by bringing the gospel, how do we get them to heaven? And I think that's pretty much the Sarah I like to present. And I know I think I have a few minutes left before we have to stop, but I'd like to tell a story to kind of, in a childlike way, not childish, but childlike, present Junipero Serra. So I would ask, because we're talking art, any of you who have your favorite church that has stained glass windows. Okay. For me, I'm going to bring it home. In the city of San Francisco, there's the church we call Notre Dame de Victoire. It's the French National Church, and it has beautiful stained glass windows. And it's just up from the shopping district, okay? It's just up from Union Square. And I often imagine that perhaps during the shopping season at Christmas time, there's a young mother and maybe she's got 1 or 2 toddlers with her. One of them perhaps is 5 or 6 years old, ready to go to kindergarten or the 1st grade. But mom is exhausted because she's carrying packages and she also has these children with her. She sees the church door, as many of us do. I do this every time I'm in Rome, and if it's hot as can be, I duck into one of all the churches just to cool down. But this mother says, well, I'll take the kids in here, we'll get a break, I'll sit them down the bench, and I'll say a few prayers. Well, the mother does that, but let's say little 6-year-old Johnny is very inquisitive, and he starts tugging at mommy, who's there at the communion rail trying to say her prayers. And Johnny's looking at the stained glass windows. And he's going, ooh, who's that? Which one's that? And mommy's looking because the window's in green. And she goes, oh, that's St. Patrick. Then this goes on in red over there. That's St. George. On and on with the various windows and the various colors till the mother realizes she's not going to get her prayer time in. And she stands up and starts walking out. And they look at the blue window over the main entrance, which is our Blessed Mother's window. Well, move forward a week or two later after Christmas break and the shopping season's over. Now Johnny's back in his classroom. And at this Catholic school, the sister, the nun who's teaching, decides in the catechism lesson today, we're going to talk about saints. And you know how the teachers will ask a question and they don't expect anybody to answer it. They just throw the question out there. And sister says, children, today we're going to talk about saints. And can anybody tell me what's a saint? To which she did not expect anyone to answer. And there's little Johnny flagging her down. Oh, sister, I know the answer. I know the answer. Well, sister in frustration, because this was not in her script for the class that day, she says, okay, Johnny, why don't you tell us and all the class what's a saint? And Johnny says, oh, sister, that's so easy. My mommy told me what's a saint. Yes, Johnny, what's a saint? Sister, a saint is someone who lets the sun shine through. And in California, we have a golden state where the sun shines, and Junipero Serra is our patron who lets the sun shine through.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. I'm cognizant of the time, and we'll be moving on. The last section will be a bit shorter. But I'd like to pause. If you would like to, if you have a brief comment or you'd like to ask a question of either Amy Giuliano or Andy Galvin, if you would turn on your video so I can see you and raise your hand and unmute yourself. If you want to ask a question and you're here by phone, just put it in the chat room and I'll ask it for you. But meanwhile, Archbishop, are you available? I just thought maybe you'd like to say a few words about what we just experienced together. You have to unmute though.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's so much to say and there's so much to learn. Amy, your tour was really incredible, so informative. There's so much to dig into and so much to learn. And Andy, you're always enlightening us about the great man of Junipero Serra. And I think both of these presentations tell us how much we have to learn and have to appreciate about our common Catholic heritage and its antiquity and how the church grew.
Archbishop, I'm sorry, I just muted. You need to unmute yourself again. I was getting fancy and I screwed it up. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so how much we have to learn, both of there's so much to learn and appreciate in our Catholic history, how the church grew up in a pagan world, but grew out of our Jewish ancestors of revealed religion. And these influences, the Jewish heritage and how the church navigated her way through the pagan world. There's so much to appreciate. Amy, a real treasure for helping us to do that. And Andy, you're always enlightening us about Saint Junipero Serra, the Franciscan friars here, and all that they did to build. What they really did is, as the church built a Christian civilization out of what was the darkness of paganism with the light inherited from Jerusalem. So the Junipero Serra and the Franciscans built a new Christian civilization here in California. I so much appreciated what you said about the artwork at the Mission Dolores, and this whole style of art that developed, style of architecture is, and truly planting the gospel in this new culture and letting this kind of blend of a new Christian civilization rise here. We have so much to learn about our Catholic heritage in California and our Catholic heritage from the time of antiquity. So hopefully we can have you back to learn a lot more. We need to spread this knowledge and appreciation. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Archbishop, and thank you, Amy and Andy. It's a nice segue to what the Benedict XVI Institute does under the Archbishop's inspiration and very active involvement. And because we've seen the power of beauty, right? And the way the church has always used beauty to teach and to touch hearts. We live in an age, and I don't know if it's the Protestant influence, you know, I'm something of an egghead myself, so don't get me wrong, I really appreciate the intellect and scholarship and intellectual arguments, and I'm pretty good at them for an amateur. But I realized really only when I took over this as executive director at the Archbishop's request, which is about 3 years ago, how powerful beauty is, not just for other people, but for me. And we had an artist retreat last week where we read Pope Benedict's letter to artists. And every time I say that, they're like, oh yeah, John Paul's letter to artists. And I'm like, no, Pope Benedict wrote one on the 10th anniversary of St. John Paul's letter. And he, you know, Benedict is a great intellectual, a brilliant man, but he has the soul of an artist, as John Paul did. And he speaks about the importance of beauty as a way of knowing, the imagination as a way of knowing. And when you really experience the reality of Christ, which can sometimes be done by direct intervention of the Lord, but often it's mediated by the power, you know, in an incarnational church, the power of sacred beauty to transform and touch souls in a way. Truth, beauty, and goodness are the three faces of God, and they're all the three great doorways to God. But the Archbishop's insight is that in contemporary world, the path of the way of beauty, the path of beauty is the one that has been neglected by the church, used the least often by the church today, and which is strange because of our centuries and centuries and centuries of history and understanding that art is not a luxury item or a frill. It's an essential part of the human soul and of touching human souls and bringing them to God. I'm going to get to the Free the Mass project, but just briefly, first of all, I want to thank all of you. Almost everyone here is a donor and as well, or a very active supporter, but most of you are donors and you help keep us going. We've been a very small and very effective organization. I want to give you a report during the age of COVID. So in March 9th, I flew home to my home in Northern Virginia to hunker down. And I looked around. We were coming off a very great cash position because of the success of Frank LaRocca's Mass of the Americas as a solemn pontifical high mass, as a Latin mass on November 19th at the Basilica of the National Shrine of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. That church we managed with our crack digital marketing team and a lot of labor on the part of the Archbishop, who was willing to do as many interviews as I could get to him about it, thank him. We just packed that church, and the online view of this beautiful Mass, it went virtual on the Basilica Shrine website, 131,000 views, as well as whoever watched EWTN televised it. So we're in a good cash position for a small religious nonprofit or arts organization. But then I realized that in March, our donors were losing their wealth, and our big donors were losing their wealth, and our small donors were losing their jobs or feared losing their jobs, and that we were an event-based organization, and we probably wouldn't be able to hold events in the real world for, I assumed, a year. That was my time frame. So I cut costs. I just slashed costs. I put myself on half pay. I went to our key consultants like the amazing Kevin Kakdinski, who is our digital marketer and fundraiser. And I didn't tell them what to do. I just said, I've cut my pay in half. What can you do? and they all responded really well, and with no, and so we managed to cut what I call our run rate from around $500,000 to around $250,000. And then in April, I looked up and said, okay, if we don't do anything for a year, nobody is going to keep this organization alive a year from now. So what do I do? And we just launched into Zoom, beginning with a simple idea of doing Compline during Easter time. And people really liked that. We transformed our Festival of Marian Hymns into a Song for Mom Fest, where anyone could come for free, but for $100 donation, you could dedicate a hymn to mom that would be sung live. Had to be solo, you can't sing together on Zoom. Somebody is playing some martial music in the background. You might mute yourself. Who's doing that? I hate to mute all. Okay, I'm gonna have to mute all, and I'll be back in a second for the rest. Okay. So we've done about 17 Zoom events, and it's been a real blessing. First of all, just on the fundraising side, which I always look at, our digital event markout turnout. Our basic model is we let anyone come for free. We've begun to ask for a $25 ticket in lieu of ticket donation if you can afford it. We tell people to come anyway if that's not reasonable for you. And we've had close to 6,000 people register for our events. And we've added hundreds of new small donors. And it's been very successful. But even more importantly to me in terms of mission, we've added an awful lot of new relationships, both with artists. On October 2nd, as I told you, we're connecting up with it. We've done a lot of co-sponsored events with other arts groups. And one of those ideas that we had, which I think is remarkably successful. So let me just pull it out briefly. Here with us is Alex Begin, who is the host of ExtraordinaryFaithTV.com, also shown on EWTN. And it's a show primarily about the Latin Mass, I would say, but also sacred beauty generally. And Alex, hat tip to you. I'm going to ask you to unmute. But I met Alex because of the Mass of the Americas. He came in November, and I learned more. We met afterwards, and I learned more about him. He's kind of an amazing guy. He was an undergraduate at Harvard, and he was converted by the Latin Mass. And he's a successful entrepreneur. And as he says, he has a lot of mileage, airline miles. And he has developed a personal apostolate over the last 20 years where he will just fly anywhere. If there's one priest who wants to learn how to do the Latin Mass, he'll fly, and you got 2 days to set aside for the training. He will teach that, and at the end of the 2 days, the priest will be able to celebrate a Latin Mass. So I was thinking about that and thinking we're not a Latin Mass society, but of course we support the great and ancient beauty of the Latin Mass, and I wondered how we could do more. And Alex agreed. We did not publicize this, so you might not have heard about it. We decided to do it as a clergy day for priests, religious, and deacons and seminarians. And we didn't know how many people would respond, but it ended up with just our normal $200 digital marketing budget and whatever. We were able to attract about 55 people came. Usually about half of people who register actually show up. So there was even more who were interested. And Alex put together a really amazing presentation featuring 3 different priests who had recently in the last few years learned how to do the Latin Mass. And so they could talk as brothers, as peers, to priests in particular about what they got out of it. Several of them now have integrated a Latin Mass into their parish. They can talk about like what to do and what to not do if you would like to bring the Latin Mass to your parish. In particular, to sum it up, don't take away anyone else's Mass. bring the Latin Mass where nobody else is doing anything, and that's the way to get started. And so I don't know, Alex. So we as after this, at the end of that, we said, okay, Alex will come in and fly in and train you if you'd like. He doesn't charge for this. He doesn't even charge expenses. He'll just do it for you. And we had, I think, at least 10, something like that, 8 to 10 priests are now trained in the Latin Mass because of that one event, which cost a total of $200. And the interesting thing, I think, Alex, you'd agree that what the digital event marketing added is out. So these were new, they were not already in your network, right? You're now networked into some new areas, including here in San Francisco, where the sisters, the Order of Cloistered Sisters wanted a Latin Mass, and they could not find anyone to do it. And so Father Gabriel Wonker volunteered to be trained. He's a very soft-spoken, I think he's Nigerian, the Archbishop would correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly African priest here now, and Father Mike Lillydahl. And there are some more people. Alex will be back in San Francisco offering it to more priests and to seminarians who are interested. So this is really on our mission of practical resources for a more beautiful liturgy, a real increase in capacity, that we take Alex's sacrificial willingness and skill, and we combine it with the team that B16 has developed in digital marketing outreach. And we got something, right? Alex, I'll stop talking. You want to just say a few words?
That's well said. There's not much I can add to that. I just think since the Institute has a mission of bringing beauty back to the church, this is one very good way, and in my opinion, easy way to do that. I think one of the worst stereotypes I hear about the traditional Mass is that it's difficult to learn. It's not difficult to learn. We can do it in 2 days. We've proven it over and over again. We just did it, as you said, in San Francisco. And so any priest who can give us 2 days, I guarantee you he'll celebrate his first Mass at the end of that second day. And that tends to lead to more things. It tends to lead to beauty in the ordinary form, tends to lead to musical programs being developed, beautification of churches and sanctuaries. There's a waterfall effect to this. So why not do it if we can?
Archbishop, I know you were at that meeting and you spoke about how you've urged priests and deacons even to learn this for their own spiritual formation. You want to say a few words about this?
Thank you, and thank you, Alex. I very much like what you said about how it has an influence on the ordinary form, the Novus Ordo as we call it, which is the vast majority of Masses celebrated in our parishes. I really believe in Pope Benedict's vision of the two forms informing each other, mutually enriching each other. So it's not just a matter of learning a new set of rubrics. It goes back to what Amy did when she played the ancient Roman chant within that basilica. Everything is tied together. It's all of one fabric woven together. So bringing this ancient beauty, rediscovering it, we can also reappropriate it in new ways, in a sense, with continuity with the tradition. My observation is that the form of the Mass we have now is, because it's not so tightly scripted as the older form of the Mass is, it doesn't by itself form a seminarian or a priest into a kind of a deep liturgical sacramental mentality. And also the vernacular, it has something to do with that as well. Not too many priests can improvise in Latin, you know. So I think the reason I want my seminarians to learn this form of the Mass is that it is in of itself formative in a proper sort of liturgical mindset and a sacramental sensitivity. It deeply enforces and reinforces that sense of the sacredness of the Mass and the centrality of the Eucharist. So with that mindset, with that deep spirituality, they can inform their celebration of the Mass. I've told them that the point is not that you will actually celebrate this Mass after you get ordained if you want to, and there's a need. It helps if there's a need that we have priests available. But most important to me is that the way you celebrate the way they celebrate the Mass as the current form of the Mass, that it be something truly holy that instills a sense of the sacred. And I think the kind of formative quality of learning the Mass and then learning the symbolism behind it, all those gestures, all those little rubrics, they all have a symbolic value. It's all the mystery of Christ, from his incarnation to his passion, death, and resurrection, is all, the whole Mass is a narrative of that. And the rubrics, gestures, all have something to do with that. So they can discover this symbolic sense, which heightens our sacramental sensitivity. So my hope is that we can have a sort of a mutual enrichment. I'm actually in Philadelphia right now. I celebrated a traditional Mass this morning for the Catholic Medical Association for the White Mass, the Mass that for medical professionals. They requested that this year it be in a traditional form. So it was the low Mass. There was a schola that sang some parts, but it wasn't with all those great solemnities. But I noticed that the people knew the responses, and the congregation participated in the responses. That's an example of how the new influences the old with that congregational participation. So I really see a great value with this Pope Benedict's vision, the patron of our institute, of the mutual enrichment of the two forms to recover the sacred and continue the project of authentic liturgical renewal.
Thank you, Archbishop. Very briefly, because I want to leave time for discussing the movement to free the Mass and the Archbishop's emergence as a leader, not only here in San Francisco, but speaking for the 67 million Americans who now live under government rules that on their face treat worship more restrictively than similar secular activities. So a great personal spiritual problem and a great constitutional and legal problem. So you heard about, we launched the St. Junipero Serra project. Actually, the Archbishop launched it when he didn't know he was doing this, but when he went into Golden Gate Park to the base of the statue that the violent mob toppled and defaced. And in this classic Catholic way of his, he spoke a few words about the evil that was done here to explain what we do, how we respond. And he responded with a minor exorcism of the statue because the evil one, as he said, was present, and a beautifully produced video circulated widely. And this was the first, I think, stirring among Catholics. They're very desperate to have someone speak out and voice what they are experiencing. And the toppling and desecration of St. Junipero Serra and really other Catholic statues in this odd iconoclastic moment we were in over the summer, that was the first step. And the Archbishop, we said, and the Archbishop immediately agreed, they topple statues, what do? We build. And so we have begun launching a project, the St. Junipero Serra project. And when we ran into Amy, which is another gift of COVID, I don't know that we would have met. We met via Zoom, and I can't even remember how that happened, except it was with Mark Brumley, the CEO of Ignatius. And so you've already heard about the digitalizing the mission churches that St. Junipero founded. We have a budget of a little less than 130,000 for this. We have raised 70 of that, so we're getting started. And the money is not only for the physical creation. It's great to put things up on the internet, and then theoretically people have access, and we can embed educational materials, and the California bishops are in the middle of creating some new materials to promote St. Junipero Serra, kind of update the narrative around him in response to the current criticisms. And but in addition, we have money to actually conduct digital pilgrimages. And it's been suggested that we should be working with California schools, because in the 4th grade, I believe, curriculum, every every California school child has to learn about the missions. And I think this would be a great opportunity, especially for those who aren't within an easy school trip of the missions. Although truthfully, my experience is that if you see something on the magic box, the television screen or the laptop screen, then you want to go see it more because you know what you're seeing. So I even think this could be used in combination. We also launched a new Works Fund for artists, and part of it is dedicated to new works honoring St. Junipero Serra. We have identified a San Francisco painter. She's extremely gifted. Her name is Bernadette Cartenson Cody. You may know she's a Star of the Sea parishioner. And she's worked primarily as a book illustrator, so she has a very strong narrative sense, but she has also been commissioned by the Dominicans to do some larger paintings. And the theme of this is St. Junipero Serra and the American Saints. So love to hear from you. Maybe email me if you got ideas for American Saints we should include. We are thinking probably 5 or 6 against a California backdrop. And the idea of the American Saints project really comes from James Matthew Wilson. And this is another example of the various interconnects and how these ideas and relationships are feeding each other and how we pay attention to them when we stumble on a great idea. And James Matthew Wilson, who is a young poet, professor, and intellectual, whom Dana Joya told me is the future of Catholic letters in America, we invited him out for the first celebration of the Mass of the Americas. Hopefully he'd be inspired to write a poem. He was inspired to write a short song cycle of 7 poems, which is called The River of the Immaculate Conception. And when I talk about this, I usually pause to add, do you know what the River of the Immaculate Conception is? Because I didn't, and I've never yet found anyone who knows, but it's the Mississippi River. Because those Jesuit missionaries, when they were out there in the 17th century, consecrated it to Our Lady. And that is part of the mostly unknown and very seldom told Catholic founding of America, which we do not mean to replace or deny the significance of what was happening on the East Coast. But we want to connect the dots through art, and this is our first. We will set up the equivalent of a GoFundMe. We're looking at platforms to see if we can get small and middle class donors to contribute. We're looking for a matching grant because that's always very motivating to get this off the ground. Our new works, which again are not specifically funded, we are funding these out of general revenues, are primarily our composer in residence, Frank LaRocca. Frank, if you're on, I didn't see you, so I would introduce you. But the Mass of the Americas, of course, is the great one. We would have this November have a second great Mass by Frank LaRocca, a Requiem Mass for the Homeless, but it's been postponed to 2021. Anyone who would like to be a patron of that process, we'd love to dedicate the Mass to a patron of the arts, or at least the composition. The Mass will be dedicated to remembering the homeless who died on the streets. And it's going to be beautiful. And there are many other music projects in the works, possibly in the spring. One of them I'm excited about is a Lenten prayer service where Frank LaRocca has commissioned 3 new works of art by composers that he values, and then we'll pair them with the classic, Renaissance or Counter-Reformation of the same text. And the model for the music is really what we're trying to do, and what we started to do before COVID halted, is recreate the great Renaissance Counter-Reformation tradition of the church, where music is commissioned from the heart of the church, and it finds new audiences by going through the great cathedrals until several hundred years later it ends up in, the Lincoln Center. So that's the vision. The Mass of the Americas has been to San Francisco. It's international. It's been to Tijuana. It's been to Houston. It was scheduled for Dallas in August. That will happen next year or as soon as it's possible in re-COVID. It went to Allentown, New Jersey. It was scheduled for Canada and in Guelph, Basilica. That was postponed because of COVID. And this is like recovering a model that the church knows works and that no one else is doing. I love Bishop Barron, and I think he's a great gift to the church, and he's so much bigger than we are. But there are two things he doesn't really do. He doesn't do liturgy, which means he doesn't do sacred music. And he also focuses almost actually entirely, as far as I've seen, on dead Catholic artists. And of course, we have such a great and glorious tradition that's understandable and wonderful. But we see our mission as connecting that old and long tradition to showing that it's not a dead tradition. It has new flowers and inspiring a new generation of artists. From a culture of craftsmanship, the geniuses come, right? You cannot call genius into being, but you can create a culture of craftsmanship in which more people are working, the artists are connected to each other spiritually and in other ways. And that's our vision moving forward. So you all have my email if you have any questions or concerns. When I send you the link to Amy's work, I'm going to send you a donate link. Some of you have already donated, please do not feel pressured, but we could use your support for this, our core work, as we have just jumped head feet into also taking on the Archbishop's Free the Mass project. I want to say in particular, Amy, I just told Amy this 2 days ago, and we haven't talked about it yet, but I really want Amy working. She's a part-time fellow. She has another full-time job by which she makes a living. I want her to be working full-time for the Benedict XVI Institute, primarily so we can promote her work entirely. I mean, there's so many things. Rich Vigilante, who's on, and he's a board member, just privately chatted with me saying, we have to get Amy branded with B16 in front of every Legatus chapter in America, because they would love this presentation. It's perfect for their meetings. And then Roseanne Sullivan was saying, we have to get her in front of Catholic school children. And that would be a big project in itself. There's so much we could do. You've seen her, some of you have seen her twice. She's amazing. So that would be something I'd be delighted to talk to you about, presuming Amy would agree to come and work for us full time. So that's in process. And now I'm gonna switch. That's my pitch for what we do. We're small, we're thrifty, we're creative, we're really on mission, and we look for new ways to jump on ideas and relationships that serve that mission. And ultimately, we serve the Archbishop. I believe that this is a providential moment for the church. I think that Archbishop Cordileone, by his courage, by his skill, and by his prudence in not jumping in early when it would have divided the church, but waiting impatiently, internally, I'm sure, but patiently, publicly, to try to work with the city until it was clear that the city was just messing with religious believers, but really in particular Catholics. This is if you want to see the news coverage, I will put in the chat box a link to, we have up on the Benedict XVI website. It's just called In the News. It's not fancy, but I try to stick literally every news story about us, or now about the Archbishop and Free the Mass, up there. So I'm going to stick that up. It's an awful lot. Our role, and I want to say, I'm going to turn it over to the Archbishop and get out of the way, but because you funded the Benedict XVI Institute and because we existed, when the Archbishop was ready to act, we were able to jump in wholeheartedly and help him figure out how to amplify his voice and make it heard. And in particular, we suggested that he launch a petition drive. When I checked before we began, we were just about 150 shy of 20,000 petition signatures. This is important to show that Catholics care about this issue, but it's also a permanent increase in our capacity to amplify his voice. So we have already used this list to ask people, for example, to call Mayor London Breed's office personally and let her know how many Catholics are unhappy with what's happening, that the doors to our churches are barred. The city actually issued a regulation that only one person at a time is allowed in San Francisco churches for private prayer. So never before seen. As I was driving down Webster Avenue last night, I snapped a photo of a little storefront, and it said chakra meditation, spiritual advice, tarot readings, and a big neon sign open, right? The things that you can do in San Francisco, one thing you can't do right now is go to inside your church for mass, or go inside for Eucharistic adoration or for private prayer if you believe the city. So let me turn it over to you, Archbishop, to say what you want to say about that.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. Yeah, you covered it. I'll just fill in some more details. But first of all, I want to thank everyone watching and all those others who have been supporting the Benedict XVI Institute. You mentioned about the Mass of the Americas and new compositions of sacred music. You pointed out something very insightful, Maggie, before that you didn't mention this time, because people may ask, there's so much facing the church. We're under so much attack. We have so many crises going on right now. What's going on internally within the church, with what's going on in society right now. And this would seem like something kind of marginal at this point, not the thing to be focusing on. But Maggie, as you pointed out before, the most beautiful music composed in the history of the church, Renaissance polyphony, was composed at a time when the church is going through some fierce storms with the beginning of Protestantism and the breakup of the whole Christian world. This was a tremendous storm the church was trying to sail through. And that's gave birth to some of the greatest, most beautiful music the church has ever produced. So this is precisely the time to do that. Again, we evangelize through beauty. We use truth, beauty, and goodness. But there's something very intuitive about beauty that you just can't argue about it. So this is precisely what we need to be doing now. So thank you for your support for that. Thank you so much for your support for the Free the Mass movement. This is a real team effort. I've formed a strategy committee and consisting of some chancery personnel and the archdiocesan offices and some people from outside the archdiocesan offices, priests and lay faithful. Maggie's been a critical part of this. She's a great strategist and kind of masterminding it. But to give you a little kind of the historical background of where we've come to this point, so the shelter-in-place order went into effect in the middle of March. Then at the beginning of June, I'll give kind of the brief touch on the high points. At the beginning of June, the city said by the middle of June, we would be able to open up for worship. And of course, it's always on a Monday. That's the effective date, right? And I've been insisting all along that there was the decision of the bishops to suspend public masses in order to cooperate with our public officials in trying to get the virus under control. The state doesn't have authority to tell the church whether or not it can worship, whether or not worship is essential or what kinds of worship is essential. The state has the authority to protect public health, and so to tell us what we need to do to protect our people when they worship, but the regulations can't be so restrictive as to effectively ban public worship. We submitted our safety protocols to the city in May at their request that faith communities do that. These have been followed all around the country. There was a committee formed out of the Aquinas Institute, a Thomistic Institute rather, in Washington, D.C., committee of people with different expertise, theologians, liturgy experts, health science experts, to put together a plan for celebrating the Mass with due dignity and reverence while also protecting people's health. So these have been adapted all over the United States, and I made my own few little tweaks and issued it for the Archdiocese, and it's been proven to be effective. The health officer himself has spoken approvingly to me of it. So they said at the beginning of June that by the middle of June, we can return to worship, but according to the health order to be issued by the city. So I did, to be honest, I anticipated by one day, since as I said, it's not the state's authority. They allowed the priest to celebrate Mass the day before because that Sunday was Corpus Christi Sunday. And I said, we may need to make some changes in our safety protocols depending on what comes out of the city's health order. But what came out was worship services were allowed only outdoors and only with a maximum of 12 people. And although they allow indoors for the purpose of live streaming a religious service, and they allow the people necessary there to conduct the service and to live stream it up to 12. So if you're live streaming, you can have 12 people inside if they all have some role in the service. If you're not live streaming, then you have to have outside with 12 people. So this obviously was very frustrating, and I had a conversation with the health officer, and he said he had this plan to put into place where we would initially 12 people inside, but as soon as possible move to the limit allowed by the state of California, which is 100. Now this is another problem as well. It's not just San Francisco. San Francisco's the worst, but others are almost as bad. The state of California issues guidelines, and then the counties can implement those according to their own health orders. They can be stricter, but not more open. The guideline for California is for religious services, 25% capacity of the house of worship up to a maximum 100 people. Well, this also is a big problem. They don't have a numerical limit on any other kind of activity, only for churches. And it's not taking into consideration the size of the building. St. Mary's Cathedral, 100 would be under 4% capacity. So that's already a problem. And now it's even much worse in San Francisco. So they issued a health order, which was effectively continuing the ban on public worship. Then there was this plan that the health officer told me, but at the beginning of 1 week, and then by the end of the week, they said there was an increase in the infection rate, so they suspended this. So this has happened now, it happened twice. So first, they said we'd open up for worship, and the health order was only 12 and only outside. Then we were going to have this plan to move quickly to 25% or 100 indoors, no limit outdoors, and then that was stopped. Then and then this just went on and on and on. I've spoken to the health officer twice. The second time was a Zoom meeting with him and the mayor, and I pulled all the stops. I explained about mental health, spiritual health, the problems this is causing for people, and that they say they're well aware of, a number of other arguments. And I said, stores issued their safety plan, you approved them, and now they're back in operation. We submitted ours in May, and we're still waiting to hear back, and we still are. So I decided that as a way to manifest the public manifestation of our faith, that we are a church. Church comes from the Greek word ekklesia, which means literally an assembly. The very definition of who we are is a people gathered in and under our Lord. So at 12 people, it's hard to think of us that's really a gathering. So we started having multiple masses on the Cathedral Plaza. It's a huge plaza. It could accommodate many hundreds of people. So we were doing 12 masses with 12 people at each mass. Then the city said they were going to open this up for religious services, and they would allow for 50 outdoors. By the way, the health order, until Maggie mentioned about one person at a time inside a church, it never was specific about that. The health order was just about churches being closed for services. So they didn't take into consideration this distinction about a worship service and people going in there individually to pray. And they knew that a lot of our churches were open and people were going in there to pray, and that we had some friction over that at times. So the new health order was issued. So here they do it again. We'll open it up for 50 gatherings for outdoors, but it prohibits multiple gatherings in the same location. And it specifies only one person at a time inside of church to pray. Okay. Now, At the same time, the city opened up these one-on-one services that involve extended contact, one-on-one. So hair salons and nail salons, massage parlors, tattoo parlors, these kinds of things. So this is indoors, extended one-on-one contact, but only one person at a time inside of church to pray. Plus, the order still is in place that allows 12 people inside to live stream a service. If they're conducting a service, they have to be closer together than people who could be spread apart inside of a church to pray. So this is the way the city has been treating us all along. So I decided we need to be more aggressive. Then we formed this Free the Mass movement. Perhaps you've seen the signs, we are essential, free the Mass. Last Sunday, we had organized 3 processions from 3 different parishes, coming from different directions, converging on City Hall. From the Mission District, beginning at St. Anthony. So this was like the Hispanic contingent, which was a Eucharistic procession. From St. Patrick's downtown, which was mainly the Filipino contingent. And then from Star of the Sea in the Richmond, which was many of the descendants of the European immigrants. So they all converged at City Hall Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, and we processed with the Blessed Sacrament to the Cathedral Plaza, where we had about 20 masses of 50 each. And I was able to preach to everyone gathered on the plaza. After the gospel reading was finished and all the masses, then we resumed the masses. So we're continuing to push. We're planning the Rosary Rally for October 3rd in the evening. It will be the Vigil Mass for us in San Francisco. It's the Solemnity of St. Francis. So we'll have a procession, again, for the Mission District and Mass, and a procession praying the Rosary around the Cathedral Plaza. Again, this is to publicly manifest that faith is essential. We as people of faith are essential. We're being unjustly deprived of our natural right to worship that is protected by the First Amendment. You may have heard that the Attorney General's office, the Department of Justice for the United States, issued a letter to Mayor Breed telling her to stop these, to use their word, draconian restrictions on religious worship, treating us unfairly and unequally, and violating the First Amendment of the Constitution. The letter says at one point that, I thought this was very insightful and incisive, that the unyielding protection that the First Amendment gives to religious believers is what distinguishes the United States from places that are ruled by tyranny and despotism. Robust religious liberty is what distinguishes the United States from many other places that are ruled like that. At the most fundamental, religious liberty means a lot of things. It's not simply the right to worship, but worship is like the most fundamental core part of the whole wider complex of what is religious liberty. We bishops have been concerned about infringements on our religious liberty in other ways to provide our services in keeping with our moral principles that are informed by our faith, and the pressure from governing authorities to force us to give those up, to comply to standards that are actually harmful and immoral. So that's already an infringement on religious liberty. But now we're seeing it's beginning to enter inside the walls of the church, where they're depriving us of our right of worship, treating us in a very unfair and unequal way. So I'm very grateful to the Attorney General and his office for coming to our aid. And we will continue, though, manifesting our insistence that our right to worship be respected. Now, the city attorney announced that as of Wednesday, they will allow indoor worship up to 50. But again, why 50? Right now, even if you go by the draconian guideline of California, we can go up to 100. So why don't they allow us 100? Why do they only allow 50? It's very clear they just can't bring themselves to allow us to fully exercise our rights. So they continue sort of playing these games with us. So we'll continue to advocate for this, and with your support, and I'm very grateful to you for that.
If people would like to put questions in the chat box, I will ask them of the Archbishop. I would like to say that with this forward-thinking and courageous leader, we're strategizing now about freeing the Mass, and I think we're going to win that battle. The letter from the Justice Department is it's an amazing advance. It's somewhat providential. We hope Ruth Bader Ginsburg's soul rests in peace, but we will have a different Supreme Court in a month. And the Supreme Court ruling, which refused to grant injunctions preventing this openly, facially discriminatory treatment of religion, was a 5-4 decision. So we will be in a very different position legally very soon. And I don't know what the Archbishop is going to do about that, but I have a feeling that we'll find out very soon. But freeing the Mass, I call that, well, the plan we're developing is called Winning the Battle for Freedom, Winning the War for Souls, because everyone knows, and the polling is quite clear, that 6 months of not attending Mass, and some would argue the acquiescence of the bishops in that, but I don't want to be divisive at this moment in the church. There's going to be a huge fall off in Mass attendance. I just saw a polling from the Georgetown Cara Institute, in which 36% of young adult Catholics age 18 to 35 say they plan to attend Mass less often than they did once the pandemic is over. And I think the actual number is higher because people will just not go back. And so we're looking at building, I don't have the right label for it, it's free the Mass, rebuild the Mass. It's not the Mass that needs rebuilding, it's the people of God's attendance at the Mass. And again, looking at a combination of what the normal diocesan processes, organizing volunteer phone banks to invite people back, but supplementing that by creating very powerful, beautiful things that touch the heart and the imagination about the miracle that happens at every Mass. Because we haven't been teaching that before. We know that an astonishing proportion of Catholics who say they go to Mass every Sunday don't believe in the real presence, and they don't know that they say, oh, I believe everything the church teaches, and they don't believe in the real presence. So that's the biggest problem I think we face in the church, and crisis is opportunity. We'll probably be coming back to you when we have a developed plan, but the basic vision is the beauty that people like Amy do so well, the incredible power of digital marketing to get this in front of people and to evangelize them and moralize them and get them to turn out for things, including the Mass, supplemented by a more conventional parish outreach program. And when I was talking to Kevin Kekbinsi, our digital marketer, about this, I said, how do we scale it? Because it's not just San Francisco. Every diocese in the area has this problem. And it would be most natural to start in San Francisco, go out into the 6 Bay Area dioceses, and from there expand to serve the church. I think this could be very big, and I'll look forward to telling you more about it now. I don't see any questions in the chat. Is that really the case? We've answered all your questions. Okay. Amy, when you get a chance, look at the chat box, because there's a lot of people who just think you're the best thing they ever saw in a long time. She's very humble as well, so she doesn't like it when I praise her like that. Look, she's like, but it's true. We love your work, and we love you, and we thank you for what you've done, and we look forward to working with you in whatever way moving forward. Archbishop, do you want to lead us out with a prayer?
Sure. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord God, we give you thanks for this time we have spent together. We ask you to enlighten us with the gift of your truth. May your Spirit guide us in the ways of understanding. Grant us a deeper wisdom to appreciate the truth and beauty of the gospel and live it out through lives of goodness. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right, well, thank you so much. Look for the link from Amy so you can wander around some more if you like. I'll try to get that out by tomorrow or maybe even tonight. And thank you. We are so blessed to have you part of the Benedict 16 family and part of Team Cordileone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, Maura.
Thank you all.
Bye,
Bye,
Archie.
Mary. Bye, Andy. Andy, thank you.
Andy.
Look forward to working with you too. All right, I'm going to say goodbye. Good
All
night.
right,
God
bye.
bless.